In this sublesson, we're going to explore data types. We'll discuss best practices when choosing data types. We'll discuss some best practices when renaming columns. And finally, we're going to demo choosing data types and renaming columns. So you may have a query that looks something like this as you extract data from a source system. Maybe it has 5 columns and the columns have names that are kind of meaningless. So in this case here, we have column 1, column 2, 3, 4, and 5. And if we were to deliver this query to the data model, nobody would know what these columns mean. So we want to be as descriptive as we possibly can on these columns because ultimately it's going to help support self-service analytics. So we want to choose a good column name for each of these. We also want to make sure that we choose an appropriate data type for each one of these columns. So for example, maybe column number 1 represents categories. So we're going to go ahead and give that column name category. And then maybe the data type should be text. So we're going to go and make sure that the data type for that particular column is set to text. Okay, so let's quickly go through the data types that are available in Power Query. So to start with, there is a text data type, which is a Unicode character string. We have the any data type, which is the status given to a column that doesn't have an explicit data type definition. And one thing that we want to do when we're going through our queries is make sure that any columns that have the any column data type are given an explicit data type. So it's up to you as the developer to go through and make sure that all of your columns get a proper data type. There's a true/false data type. There's a date data type, which represents only the date portion of a date with no time. There's a time data type, which represents only the time of day with no date portion. And there's a date time data type, which represents both. Now, as a best practice while we're on this slide here, if you have analysis that requires both date and time for analysis, it's recommended to split this into 2 separate columns. And once again, that all depends on the type of analysis you're doing. If you're doing analysis that does not care about the time portion of the date, and you have that, go ahead and just get rid of it, chop the time portion off, and use the date data type. But if time is significance to you, then go ahead and keep it. So for example, if you were doing analysis on grocery stores and you wanted to understand traffic patterns across the time of day, time would be significant because we want to know, are we getting more traffic in the morning, the afternoon, certain times of day? In that case, the time is significant. But as a best practice, we try to avoid the date time data type. So be explicit about which one of those 2 types that we want to go ahead and choose. There's the decimal number, which represents a 64-bit 8-byte floating point number. It's the most common number type and corresponds to numbers as you usually think of them. There's a fixed decimal number, also known as the currency type. This data type has a fixed location for the decimal separator. The decimal separator always has 4 digits to the right and allows for 19 digits of significance. There is a whole number data type, which represents a 64-bit 8-byte integer value. Because it's an integer, it has no digits to the right of the decimal place. Other data types, just to make note of, are the date, time, time zone data type, the duration, and percentage, and the binary data type. If you'd like more details on these data types, you can go to the website listed at the bottom here, and I'll go ahead and pull that up. And this will go into more in-depth discussion into the data types inside of Power Query. But for now, the discussion that we've gone through in the first few slides is good enough to get you moving. Okay, let's just briefly discuss some data type best practices. As a best practice, we want to give columns a proper data type as soon as possible. And that is because when we actually get columns of information from our sources into Power Query, the type of data that column contains will influence all the different transformations that you can do from that point forward. So it's a best practice to choose a data type as quickly as possible. And that's largely one of the reasons why the Power Query editor will do a blanket determination of data types against your sources. And we'll show you what that looks like as we move into this sublesson. We select the column data types based on how the column will be used. And we also want to consider storage considerations. We won't dive into the storage considerations too much right now because that's a little bit of an intermediate to advanced level topic. But these are the things that are generally used to influence the type of data that you want to choose for a column. And the same reason that we want to give a data type as early as possible, we want to actually go through and rename columns as quickly as we possibly can as well. And 3 of the reasons why we rename columns are the following. They're used for better readability and self-service. So if I have a column that I'm expecting an end user to be able to immediately understand, choosing a column name that makes sense and is descriptive is a good choice. So we want to do it for readability and self-service. We'll also find that when we get into the reporting section, choosing good column names is going to encourage and help better results in the Q&A functionality. The last reason we want to do it is it just promotes consistency in the data model. So for example, let's just suppose that we have 2 columns that exist in 2 different tables and they both represent regions. We are better off in Power Query to go ahead and standardize the names of those columns across both tables and call them region. So we'll show you some examples as we move through here where we violate some of those best practices and standards, but where if we actually follow those best practices, we're going to find that our Power Query editor experience is a whole lot quicker, seamless, and more efficient. So let's go ahead and get ourselves into the Power BI desktop so we can go through and do some demos. Okay, so in our collection of files from GitHub, we can see that we've got a file here called Sales Data Mart SL0207. Let's go ahead and open that file up, and then we'll get ready to do some work in it. Okay, so I've got my Power BI desktop file open. I'm going to go to the transform data command here, get the Power Query editor window open. And what I'm going to do here first is go into my order date query to go ahead and make sure that the data types have been set properly. So if I go into my order date query and just go across the top and take a look at each one of these columns, I can see that they've all been given the any data type designation. And the way I can tell that is at the very top it says ABC123, and that is the symbol that represents, or the icon that actually represents the any data type. So I'm just going to go ahead and zoom into that so you can see it a little bit easier. There it says ABC123. So on my order date column, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go down and make that a data type of date, like so. And we can see now that the icon has changed to this icon here. And now that is representing a date with no time component to it. But if I look to the right here, I can see that I've only managed to change one of the actual column data types. So what I'm going to do here is actually show you how to blanket change all of these at once. So I'm just going to zoom back out. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually just going to get rid of this change type step. So this was the step that was just added from me changing from the any data type for order date to the actual date. So I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of that. And the way that we can go ahead and change all of the columns at once is by clicking on the first column here, by clicking in the order date here and going Control A, which is going to highlight all of the columns. Now what we can do is to go up into the Transform tab here. And what we can do in the any column group is there's this command here called detect data type. So if I click that, it's going to go through for every one of the columns in this particular query and go through and detect the data type that it figures should be chosen. So we can see here in the order date, it chose date. So we're happy with that. Going across all these columns, just doing a quick scan, it appears as though the data types have been set properly. The only one that I actually want to change is this one here called month year. So if I was to go back into my Excel spreadsheet, which I'll go ahead and bring up here right now, I can see in the order date Excel spreadsheet, if I just scroll over to the right, I've got a column down here called month year. And my intention for that particular column was to have the first 3 letters being the abbreviation of the month, followed by a dash, followed by the year. So the Power Query editor was actually being a little friendly for me and actually attempted to change that into a date data type. In fact, it didn't just attempt it, it actually did it. But I really want the data formatted like this. So I want to force this value to be a text or the data type for that particular column. So I'm going to go back into the Power BI desktop, into the Power Query editor, and I can see that the data type here has been set to date, which is what happened for us automatically when we did this blank detect data type. But what I want to do here is change this to a text data type. So I'm going to click the icon next to month year, say text. I'm going to get a dialog box that pops up and says, do you want to replace the existing type conversion that was done in that blanket data type detect, or do you want to add a brand new step to the applied steps? And what I'm going to do here is just say replace current. So I'm basically overriding what Power BI did for me automatically and replacing with text value. And now we can see that the month year column has the proper data type on it, and the column is formatted the way that we're going to want to see it when it comes to report time. So carrying on with our data type selections, what I'm going to do here is I want to move to the United States query here. And I go through all the columns here and I see that product key is a text value, which looks okay to me. Order date is a date value. Sales territory regions a text. Order quantity is a whole number, which looks good to me. And unit price is showing up as a text. So this is something I want to fix, but I'm going to purposefully leave this data type alone for now so that we can show you in a subsequent sublesson the ramifications of not doing this in this location here and some of the benefits we can get by actually getting this data set properly. So we're going to purposefully leave this unit price as a text value. So next, let's go down to our product query and go through and take a look at each one of the data types. And what we're going to do here is take a look at the product key. That looks acceptable. Subcategory key is showing up as the any data type. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And I'm going to change this to text like so. And I'm going to go across my product description, and once again, it's showing up as the any data type, and I'm going to also change that to a text value. Scrolling a little bit more to the right, or going to the next column here, we can take a look at standard cost, and this one is showing up as a text value, but I want to make this one a fixed decimal number. So I'm going to go in here to fixed decimal and say replace current, like so, and now the standard cost has been given the data type of fixed decimal place. And lastly, let's go into our other countries query down below here. And what I want to do is I'm going to go find my other ERP unit price column and just move over here. Let's go ahead and find it. At the very end here, we can see that the the data type was set to decimal number. We're actually going to go ahead and change this to fixed decimal. So I'll also choose replace current because Power BI did an automatic data type detection for us, and we're just going to say go ahead and replace what was currently there. Now keep in mind the error that I'm going to try and trip here is later on in a subsequent sublesson, we are going to append the other country sales and the United States sales together. And keeping in mind here that we actually now have two different data types on the unit price columns across both these queries. So I purposefully left them broken so we can show you some of the benefits of naming standardization and data type standardization early on in the process. Okay, so now that we've got all the data types set the way we want, now I'm going to go through and do some column renaming. So sticking with the other country sales query, which I'm on right now, what we're going to do is go over to the column here called product alternate key, and we're going to put spaces between each one of these words here. So there's a number of different ways to rename a column. You can right click on the column header and go down a little bit lower and click rename. So let's go ahead and do that in the first one. So I'm going to just go ahead and put spaces in between each one of these words here. So it says product space alternate key with a space between all those, and go ahead and hit enter like so. And next what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, and all of these columns have the word, or the rest of the columns have other ERP in front of the column names. I want to go through and get rid of other ERP across all these columns. So what I'm going to do this time, instead of going into the dialog box, I'm just going to double click on the column header itself, get rid of other ERP, go order space date, hit enter, and then I'm going to go through and rename the rest of the columns following that technique. So what I'm going to do here is if I just scroll my data preview to the right a little bit, and the rest of the columns here that have other ERP in front of them, I'm just going to go ahead and change all those and get rid of other ERP in front of each one of these things, and then put a space between all the words in these columns. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. So you can see that I've gone through, at least the ones on the screen, you can see I've gone through and removed the other ERP prefix and put spaces in between each one of the words, and gone through and done that in all of the columns themselves. If I want, in my formula bar, I can actually drop this down here, and we can see that here's the M code that is showing all of the different column renames. So the original name and then the brand new name on the right-hand side of this particular function here. You'll also notice, given that I grouped all these renames together, it was able to actually put it all inside of one applied steps. So this is really nice reason for kind of doing this all at once and getting things standardized as quickly as possible. That it wraps it all into one step and doesn't scatter renamings all through your applied steps. So the one last column rename that we want to point out is under product level. So I'm going to go to the product level query, and we can see here that we have a column called product subcategory key with no spaces in between here. Now, ideally, I'd like to call this one product key with a space in between, but I'm going to leave this rename until a subsequent sublesson so I can once again show you the value of coming through and giving your columns consistent names across your data model, which really promotes ease in the data transformation steps within the Power Query editor. Okay, so with that, we are done talking about renaming columns and setting data types.